Welcome everybody to the Practice Standards for Dysphagia Intervention. We appreciate all the dedicated hours and commitment you've shown to your patients during these last 3 years when you've been asked to perform under exceptional circumstances, going above and beyond your usual quality of services. We recognize that you were some of the important frontline workers who continue to work day in, day out through tough times during COVID-19 without having a chance to stop and breathe. You made personal sacrifices to help others, and we thank you for that. As this e-forum is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement may not represent the lands upon which you are now. If this is the case and you have not already done so, I ask that you acknowledge the traditional territory you are currently on. At the College of Audiologists and Speech-Language Pathologists of Ontario, we acknowledge the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I'm currently today in Niagara region, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. As part of this acknowledgement, I recognize my own need for further understanding and personal education and make a commitment to recognize and honor the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit patients and colleagues I work closely with. One of the most meaningful educational interactive online courses I've participated in recently to increase my own awareness, my own understanding, and the need to be responsive to Indigenous specific racism was on Indigenous culture safety within healthcare. So we're just going to go also through some housekeeping items. It's helpful to close all other running applications to maintain a stable connection. If you are for any reason experiencing technical issues, then exit GoToWebinar and return into the session. This recording and these slides will be posted on our website, and you can see in the screenshot below. So you go into the About CASLPO, there's a section called Events, and under that section circled is eForums web-based, and that's where you'll find this webinar along with others under 2023. Also, feel free to type in your questions. There is an orange-red arrow on the right-hand side that shows where there's some questions, where you can enter questions. Samita will be monitoring our questions. And of course, we'll stop for questions during the presentation and at the end. And for your convenience, we have also put in two resources, the English and the French Dysphagia Intervention Practice Standards. I'll introduce myself. I'm Sarah Chapman-Jay. I'm advisor for speech language pathology, professional practice, and quality assurance. I also want to mention that I've been working for several years, decades even, in dysphagia across many different settings and even in 2 countries. So I bring that experience to this, and I'll pass it over to my colleagues.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Dana Prucci. I'm also a speech pathologist, and I'm the Director of Professional Practice and Quality Assurance at CASLPO.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Samita Joglekar. I'm an audiologist, and I'm the Audiology Advisor and Manager of Mentorship at CASLPO.
Thank you. So what topics are we covering today? Well, we're going to talk about why and how the Dysphagia Intervention Practice Standards were revised. We'll have an overview of these revised standards. We will be addressing any significant changes in the standards, and usually some top favorites are us going through scenarios and questions and answers to the ones that you pose to us.
So let's start off with why and how the practice standards were revised. As you know, CASLPO protects the public by regulating the practice of speech-language pathologists in Ontario and this includes the creation and revision of practice standards. We know that practice standards are the minimal performance level required to provide safe quality service and care. So this is the bar at which registrants must be performing or above. The expectation is that you are meeting these standards. These are not aspirational, but the bar again, and falling below the standard is considered professional misconduct. The standards must be achievable for every speech pathologist in every setting, and it's the regulator's role to determine what these minimum performance expectations are based on a number of considerations: practice trends, changing practice environments, practice advice questions, and technological advancements. For instance, the big jump with virtual care. The Practice Matters Committee reviewed the original Practice Standards and Guidelines for Dysphagia Intervention by Speech-Language Pathologists, and they found the need to update to become more current. The original ones had redundant content, and it was 37 pages long, and there have been technology changes. For instance, it said VFSS recordings must be captured on videotape. There were older references from 2007 and earlier, and the practice standards and guidelines were very much textbook-like and instructional. They were very prescriptive as opposed to being principle-based. The practice standards and guidelines lack that flexibility to apply to current and changing practice environments and situations, again, like virtual care. There were lines like minimum temporal resolution of 30 frames per second, which is something that is different now. Standards need to stand the test of time and apply to all situations. Practicing clinicians and academic faculty at the Canadian programs were involved in developing all of the competencies, and we also wanted to include patient autonomy in decision-making. The new standards address diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, ensure that they're applicable in all practices, and also they're not a handbook for dysphagia assessments and treatment or specific populations. These are overarching principles. So even though we don't list standardized tools or outcomes, it's expected that speech pathologists practicing dysphagia intervention would be aware of and remain current on them. We are relying on professional judgment in the patient's best interest. And finally, removing guidelines. The guidelines were written as should statements, but really the standards are a must. These are minimum expectations. So any important shoulds were included as competencies or made into must statements or removed if they were no longer relevant.
Thank you, Dana. So maybe you're asking, well, what's the process when we look at developing or revising any of our standards? So there's a diagram here, and we'll just take you through it, starting on the left-hand side. So it always starts with research, consultation, and creating drafts. A very valuable part of the revision is having an advisory working group, and we had 10 speech pathologists from across Ontario. I will talk about that a bit further. Then it goes to the Practice Matters Committee for their review. And following that, when they've agreed with the sort of most recent draft, then we reach out to all of you. All the registrants would have received that opportunity to contribute to this document. And so that is the stakeholder consultation. Following that, we received much feedback and comments, and those got added into the document, and it went for final approval to the CASLPO Board of Directors in December 2022. Then they were published on our website, both in English and French. Now is today, the e-forum is happening right now, and the next steps following today will be compiling some frequently asked questions, depending on the questions you send in to us today, as well as a public-facing document. So, moving on. Let's talk a bit about what the background information involved. So there was research and consultation that took place obviously prior to revising these standards. We did this at a provincial, national, and international level, an environmental scan of health regulatory colleges and associations, as well as current best practices in North America regarding standardized protocols and evidence-based practice. And at this point, as I said earlier, you know, I have had experience over the years working in different areas, and it's very interesting seeing what's changed over the years and what has stayed the same. So I think there's some core parts: clinical swallowing assessment, oral mechanism exam, case histories. But obviously, we've seen some significant changes as well, maybe in swallowing rehabilitation options, maybe paying increased attention, certainly in the hospitals, to vital signs such as respirations per minute, oxygen saturation levels, and an increase in standardized protocols, and obviously a lot of research over the years about also implementing different swallowing strategies. I know when I started, there were maybe some key strategies that you almost applied for every patient, and absolutely that is not the case anymore. You know, you want to make it unique to each patient. So when I explored these other regulatory health colleges, there were some interesting findings. It turns out that actually few of these colleges have practice standards for intervention. And really carrying out intervention in any college, obviously in ours today, we're talking about dysphagia intervention, is expected knowledge. It's expected that you are competent in these skills with your knowledge, skills, and training to provide the intervention that's needed. And that most colleges are relying on their entry to practice competencies and broad high-level principles. So based on these findings, CASLPO retained the standards for intervention, dysphagia intervention, but we also made some significant revisions. What were our objectives when we were doing these revisions? Well, the idea was to apply high-level principles which stand the test of time and still address risk of harm. The standards are not meant to tell you exactly what to do in every situation. They are principles that are broadly applied, and then you bring in your own professional skills, your own experience and knowledge to help you make good clinical reasoning and decision making around this area. They are supposed to be shorter in length and improve clarity by eliminating prescriptive content, which Dana's referred to. So this current document has 13 standards, and it's replaced 24 standards and 26 guidelines. We wanted to ensure the new standards are current, relevant, and reflect current practice, and that was a large role of the advisory working group, and place emphasis on professional judgment to make reasonable decisions in the best interests of your patient. And a new aspect to these standards are that we added competencies. You may ask, where did the competencies come from? And they came from the entry to practice speech-language pathology competencies published in 2018, and those are available on our website in SLP practice. So contributors to these national competencies included practicing clinicians and academic faculty across Canada, so at various Canadian programs, and they were all involved in the process. These standards, the aim is also that they can be applicable in all settings, whether it's the hospital, long-term care home, a retirement home, the patient's home, rehabilitation sites, and the hope is that they work for all practices across Ontario. So let's now look at the advisory working group. These went to an advisory working group last year, and there were 10 SLPs who graciously agreed to be part of this group. We reached out to you all as registrants, and these 10 agreed to join the group. There was a wonderful range of clinical experience. You can see in this chart, people in rehabilitation, hospitals, schools, working with children, with adults, with experience with videophroscopy, with fees, some working in research and teaching, and some in specialty areas such as head and neck cancer. So what was the role of the advisory working group? Well, their role was to review the draft and provide feedback, both individually, and then we got together as a group for a maximum, I think it was about 8 hours in total, 2 half days. And we wanted them to identify professional behaviors or areas that may be missing from the draft and provide recommendations to the staff and the Practice Matters Committee. So there were questions we asked the advisory working group, and they were these. So does the standard, each of the 13 standards, represent current dysphagia intervention practice? Will it stand the test of time? Does it clearly explain the minimal performance expectation of an SLP? Does the standard address risk of patient harm? Is it reasonable to say it would be professional misconduct if an SLP did not meet this standard or failed to provide a rationale for not meeting the standard? And ultimately, was there anything else that was missing? So they provided a lot of feedback and a new draft was created, and then following practice committee agreement, then it came out to you as stakeholders for your responses. And we sent out a survey last October. 92 people responded to this. There was some unanimous agreement in certain standards, such as consent, case history, and the guiding principles and definitions. There was, I would say, some sort of an outlier was the instrumental assessment, because some of them said, well, it didn't apply to them. Obviously, that one, standard 8 about conducting instrumental assessments, only applies to those who have the facilities and equipment to conduct videophrospees and FEEs with the knowledge and training required. But overall, 96% agreement was shown on the survey that they felt the standard is clear, they can implement it in their practice, and that the standard would protect the public. So these standards represent the current knowledge and skills and judgment required to provide dysphagia intervention to patients across the lifespan. So we've provided them to you as resources, but you can also find the English and the French version on our website. And if you're looking where they are, you can go onto the CASLPO website, and under registrants, there is a whole section on standards and resources, not just under SLP practice, but there's other topics such as code of ethics, conflict of interest, advertising, billing, private practice. So there are many resources here, but you want to go under SLP practice. It will give you another drop down of what they are, and under standards you will find dysphagia on the left in English and on the right in French. All right, so now let's actually take a closer look at what is going on in the dysphagia intervention standards. So the opening part is the guiding principles and definitions, which we've really shared with you, certainly around the guiding principles already. There are 13 practice standards. These are now all must standards that define that minimum performance level. And under each of them, there's a description about the standard and followed with competencies. And these describe the actions and behaviors required to meet the standards. If we're looking at the definitions, I think many of these you will be familiar with. Obviously, dysphagia. It's important to note with the intervention that includes screening, assessment, and management. There's definitions for patient. I know that in some areas we refer to them also as clients, and in school settings often as a student. And there are also definitions about risk of harm that you can review. The standard, we've referred to this numerous times, but really the standard speaks to deciding what is reasonable given the circumstances, the setting you're in, and the way you use your professional judgment. One of the comments from the advisory working group was they wanted substitute decision maker added into the definitions. And that is, I think we're all familiar with this, certainly probably in acute care settings, ICU, potentially complex continuing care. There are times when the person who is authorized to give consent may need to step in on behalf of a patient if they are deemed incapable with respect to consent to intervention. All right, so let's look at the standards themselves. There are different sections. The first one is determining the intervention approach. And this is an overarching standard that you will recommend an effective dysphagia plan of care that addresses the patient's concerns while minimizing patient risk. You would check that you have the required resources to be able to provide those clinical swallowing assessments and intervention that follows. You would also make any appropriate and expedient referrals where and when needed. Risk assessment and management is something that happens not just initially, but throughout your intervention. And really, already you'll notice the standards that we're talking about are things that you are already doing every day. When we look at components of service delivery from standard 5 to standard 8, obviously you're always seeking consent, obtaining and documenting consent for all aspects of dysphagia intervention. You will be conducting a case history, reviewing relevant background information. You conduct your clinical swallowing assessment, and as needed or required, those of you that do provide instrumental assessment, that you would also provide that with the required competencies. In terms of swallowing management, again, these are very familiar to you all, that you will inform, educate, and counsel the patients on the results, provide any additional information. Standard 10 is about acknowledging patient autonomy. So this, I think, is one that stands out as a new standard, obviously recognizing patients' rights. And standard 11 about further intervention. Standard 12, again, the advisory working group really felt it was important that we impress the importance of documentation when we are providing dysphagia care. And the last one is virtual dysphagia intervention, which we'll refer to a bit later as well.
So some significant changes we wanted to point out. Standard 10 addresses patient autonomy, which we're all familiar with from the Code of Ethics. We know that it's not uncommon for patients to express their own wishes regarding diet modifications when faced with swallowing problems, and they may choose to eat or drink foods that are potentially unsafe given their clinical presentations. But Principle 1 of the Code of Ethics talks about patient autonomy, how speech pathologists acknowledge and respect the rights of patients to make informed choices and decisions about their health care. Audiologists and speech-language pathologists shall respect patients and substitute decision makers' rights to collaborate in all clinical decisions and be informed of the nature of the services and the potential risks and benefits. Standard 13 is obviously a change that was very important in response to changes in technology, current and upcoming, and the increasing need from the public to have access to virtual dysphagia care in a way that is convenient for them. However, if you're performing assessments virtually, you still need to be aware and following all of the other standards, including risk assessment and management, consent, case history, swallowing safety, etc. And of course, there's the inclusion of competencies and the removal of the guidelines. The standards are not step-by-step protocols. They don't tell you exactly what to do, and they aren't meant to. The standards require you to use your knowledge, skill, and judgment to make decisions on how to conduct an accurate and thorough assessment given the characteristics and circumstances of the patient. You're expected to be making your decisions in the patient's best interest, using your ability to analyze and interpret results, provision of clinical advice and recommendations, and recognizing when to seek clinical support and use additional resources and professional consensus. Okay, so this takes us to our first break for questions.
Okay.
Sarah and Dana.
Questions?
There's one question that's come through that's related to the presentation, what you've presented so far. And that question is, will there be specific practice standards or continuing education for specific patient populations, such as stroke patients, patients with head and neck cancer, or trach patients?
Okay, thank you. That's an excellent question to start us all off with. So I guess my answer initially is no, because what you would do is turn to current best practices and research in the field, leaders in the field of dysphagia. Associations are providing lots of educational opportunities. There are research societies, special interest groups, and really any additional training that you can build on your knowledge and skills in these areas. So, I mean, I can give an example. When I started out and studied neurology, yes, I might have learned about dementia and strokes and progressive neurological conditions. But oh my goodness, I mean, how much does this keep changing, let alone within a decade, but within the last year? So there is no way that the aim, that's why these standards are high level principles, so that you decide what you need to get additional training in or education in. There are, and I guess with online educational opportunities, that has so grown over the years. So I think the aim is that keep looking for ways to stay educated and knowledgeable in these areas. Keep your skills going. Check in with your peers. I know video fluoroscopies, when I went to do video fluoroscopies, and if I was questioning something or saw something fascinating or interesting, I immediately went back to my colleagues and wanted to calibrate with them. Am I seeing what you think I'm seeing? And having a chat. So really looking and exploring all these different ways that you can continue your own education. Hopefully that's an answer to that question.
Okay, if there's time for one more, there is one more question, and it's, can you clarify what you mean by expedient referrals? So I think this is referring to the standard on making an appropriate referral. It says this is not something that's always in our control. So can you speak a little to expedient referrals?
Yes, so it's about recommending those referrals. Obviously, you only have control over the part that you can control. We do know, again, as a peer assessor across Ontario, it really helped highlight to me how different the resources, equipment, referrals, response to referrals are in different parts of Ontario. I remember seeing somebody on Manitoulin Island. Well, over the winter, they couldn't even leave the island, maybe for a video fluoroscopy. So there's just so many times when you can make those referrals. But again, if I look at that, let's just check that actual standard. It is number 3. Thank you. Right, must make appropriate and expedient referrals when they do not have the required resources. So it's understood that you're going to make reasonable accommodations when referrals are delayed. So that is in the text below the standard. There are times when, again, you can follow the general collaboration standards for referrals, or when you're involving other professionals in the plan of care. But we recognize that, yes, it's not always expedient. You're going to make your best efforts.
Perfect. Thank you very much. No more questions at this time.
Okay, so let's continue. I will share my screen again. And we're going to move into the scenarios. So this is where we're taking those standards and actually putting them into a situation or into situations. So here is the story about Mr. Bajaj. And Mr. Bajaj was admitted to the hospital with aspiration pneumonia, atrial fibrillation, and type 2 diabetes. He speaks fluent Punjabi and a little bit of English. Mr. Bajaj is 79 years old and he lives in Ontario. Complaints identified include a sudden onset of swallowing difficulties, complaints of food sticking in his throat, and a change in vocal quality. He's referred to speech pathology. Mvanwi is his speech pathologist, and she visits him, she meets him in the ER, and she sees that no one has accompanied him. She's reviewed his medical history and has a short conversation with Mr. Bajaj. Can he provide consent for a swallowing assessment? So I'm going to open our first poll. So the answers here, you can choose from yes, if he understands, appreciates what consent to assessment involves, using a supportive conversation strategies to help him provide consent, or you may choose B, no, you need to find out who the substitute decision maker is and ask them before providing any services. Or C, maybe you're not sure. All right, I think we'll give this about 3 more seconds and then we'll close the poll. All right, so let's share the results. So we have an overwhelming majority for A, but a few votes for B and some people that are not sure. So let's see what we had thought. So for the question, can he provide consent for swallowing assessment? We felt yes, again, if he understands, appreciates what consent to assessment involves, and of course the idea of using supportive conversational strategies to help him provide consent. So this can go under standard 5. Speech language pathologists must obtain and document consent for all aspects of dysphagia intervention. It is your responsibility to determine capacity. As an speech pathologist, it is not the patient's responsibility to demonstrate capacity. Mr. Bajaj shows that he understands that he has swallowing problems and his medical history. He is able to understand that information that is relevant to making a decision about the dysphagia intervention, and he's also able to appreciate the reasonably foreseeable consequences of a decision or a lack of decision. It's important to minimize communication barriers by choosing the methods that are most appropriate, whether it's oral, nonverbal, or written methods, or of course, using an interpreter. There's also standard 1, and this is the overarching standard that has all principles, and it's applicable for all contexts and all patients. We want to consider such factors as medical history, the patient, if it's an initial or follow-up assessment, the patient's presenting concerns, needs, and unique characteristics, the available equipment, and the environment. We have some wonderful competencies that go under standard 1, and these are determining the appropriate procedures, developing an evidence-informed intervention plan, applying clinical reasoning, adapting or modifying intervention, monitoring the consent, and delivering an inclusive, patient-centered intervention. Scenario 2 for Mr. Bajaj. When Mavanwi recognizes that Mr. Bajaj requires additional supports for communication, how can she ensure an inclusive, patient-centered intervention? And this comes under standard 1, competency F. And we really included this question because we had a lot of feedback from the stakeholders wanting more information. So I'm going to launch this poll, and this is one where you can choose all that apply. There we go. How can Mavanwi provide inclusive, patient-centered intervention? Would it be uniqueness of the person, food choices and preferences, their health beliefs, values, and literacy, their communication, behaviors, and expectations from a cultural perspective, or patient autonomy, choice versus safety?
And while they're choosing, Dana, we just will explain. You will see some abbreviations like behavior. It only allows us to put in so much information, doesn't it, in these polls? So hopefully you all understand what we mean by our abbreviations.
That's why we're reading out the answers at the same time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to close the polling. Sorry if you didn't get a chance to come in here. Let's see what everybody thinks. So there's a lot of agreement with these suggestions that were out there. So let's see what we had decided. It's really all of the above. We want to consider the food expectations, any religious dietary restrictions, lack of access to preferred foods. And we know that patients are less likely to follow therapy recommendations if they feel discriminated against in a health setting. We want to consider things like communication styles, personal space, touch, eye contact, and nonverbal communication, and really the list goes on. It's important to remember our patient-centered principles to support the equitable and inclusive care, including recognizing each person's uniqueness, practicing with cultural competence and cultural humility, addressing and recognizing our own conscious and unconscious bias, and engaging in anti-racist and anti-discriminatory practice. We do have CASLPO's Guide for Equitable and Inclusive Services as well. We also want to avoid false assumptions. Examples might be patients will give up their familiar favorite foods they enjoy in order to be able to swallow safely, or they'll put aside their religious dietary restrictions when instructed to do so by a healthcare team, or end-of-life directives are the same for everybody.
Okay, so moving on to scenario 3, Mr. Bajaj's case history and clinical swallowing assessment are showing a number of dysphagia-related risk factors, including inadequate oral care, inability to swallow, oral medications, some weight loss, and dehydration. So we can look at standard 4, which talks about identifying risk of harm associated with dysphagia intervention and taking reasonable steps to mitigate risk. And of course, acknowledging consideration of risk must occur continually when making decisions about how you are proceeding with intervention. And standard 6 talks about speech pathologists must review relevant background information and obtain a case history to determine a patient's specific dysphagia intervention needs. So Mivanwi, the speech pathologist, completes the clinical swallowing assessment and makes recommendations for a soft and bite-sized dysphagia diet and discusses this with Mr. Bajaj, providing reasons why. She is able to access a Punjabi handout on soft and bite-sized dysphagia foods, which provides information on the safest food textures and strategies on and also she includes strategies on ensuring optimum swallowing safety. So while Mr. Bajaj is following most information in English, there are, as we all know, lots of atypical or unusual dysphagia content words that we use. And so that Punjabi handout was also helpful for him. Now, interestingly, in his case, he also insists on eating naan with all his meals. This is something he's always done, and he wishes to continue with this. He does recognize that this could put him at higher risk. So a question we're going to ask you now is, does Mr. Bajaj have the right to make informed choices and decisions about which food to eat if he is not following all the SLP's recommendations? And the answers, or possible answers, are A, yes, B is no, or C is not sure. So go ahead and vote for one of these choices. We'll give you some time. Okay, so yes, unanimously, I'd say 99% have said yes to Mr. Bajaj having the right to make informed choices and decisions. And we would agree with you. So yes, so this is when we look at standard number 10, which is about speech language pathologists delivering swallowing management that acknowledges the patient autonomy. So let's just look at some of the competencies under this standard. So yes, you are going to consider the patient when providing appropriate diet texture modifications, postural adaptations, swallowing rehabilitation exercises, and safe swallowing strategies. You are going to respect the patient's and substitute decision makers' rights to collaborate in those clinical decisions around their dysphagia care. And of course, inform them of the nature of the services and any potential risks that you would want to explain. You are also expected to modify or adapt the management plan while respecting your patient's wishes and ensure the patient understands and appreciates the decisions they're making related to dysphagia plan of care and any additional risks that may be attached to this.
Now let's look at scenario 5, documentation. How will Mivanwi document and approach a situation with Mr. Bajaj when he is going against her recommendations for dietary texture, even with her education and explanation of the rationale for the swallowing care plan? The speech pathologist needs to document the assessment findings, interpretation, summary, and recommendations, the patient's wishes and their understanding of the risks and possible consequences of not following the recommendations, as well as additional safety measures on how to manage the swallowing problem. What happens if the SLP does not document on time? Well, very likely Mr. Bajaj will be questioned by everyone why he is eating none when he is on soft and bite-sized diet. There will be unclear expectations and recommendations, which will lead to confusion for the patient and for others involved. We know that record keeping is a reliable vehicle of communication and needs to reflect the plan of care agreed upon by the patient and all of those involved. And this was another one of those questions that there was lots of feedback wanting more guidance from the stakeholder review. And what did it mean to have a reasonable time? So we wanted to ask and sort of think about the question, how soon should registrants be documenting? The answer is as soon as possible, and even sooner when it's related to patient risk of harm or safety concerns. Standard 12 says the patient record serves as a vehicle of communication and must be accurate, complete, up to date, accessible, and securely stored. But you really want to follow your own organization's policy on documentation. When visiting places like rehab sites, hospitals, long-term care homes, or places where you document in their medical charts, it's important to document before you leave the facility. Documenting contemporaneously with the patient encounter really promotes accuracy and completeness. And the longer the delay between the visit and documenting in the record, it makes the record even less reliable. Okay, so I think it's time to take another break for questions as we're partway through our scenarios.
Thank you. So there is a question that has come through, and that question is, it was mentioned that the patient, Mr. Bajaj, only has minimal use of English. So would his English capacity be enough for him to provide informed consent?
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question, especially given all the different patients we see. We all encounter patients where maybe their understanding or their ability to speak English could be compromised in some way. But the important thing is to really understand when we're asking for consent for services, what we're asking is, are they capable to consent to the health treatment being proposed at this time? So in this case, Mr. Bajaj had sufficient English to, first of all, understand the information that was relevant for him to make a decision about assessment and treatment, and he was able to appreciate the reasonably foreseeable consequences of a decision or a lack of decision. Now, we do have a section in our resources on consent and capacity, and there is a very useful resource that we developed actually along with some other colleges. It's a capacity decision tree to determine who provides informed consent. And so it takes you along the paths. If you feel they do understand and appreciate and have that conversation around consent for dysphagia services, then yes, if you feel they're capable, and again, you know, we talked about you will supply any additional conversational supports, then you would go ahead and proceed with the intervention.
Great. There is a question about working with children and how informed decision-making applies when working with children, sort of related to, I would think, maybe when a patient is perhaps not capable of providing the consent, so how to navigate that type of scenario for dysphagia services.
Okay, so again, there's not really an age cutoff regarding consent. So depending on the age of the child, they, you know, if they are understanding and appreciating the consequences of that decision, then you can ask them. Obviously, the younger children, they usually will have somebody who is their substitute decision maker. There is a hierarchy of substitute decision makers. And again, that's in our consent and capacity resources, the entire hierarchy of who you'd ask first, second, third, etc.
That's great. And there is a question on Could you speak to consent for services in an acute care setting? It can take time to get a hold of a substitute decision maker, and sometimes the assessment and treatment is needed in a timely manner to reduce harm to the patient.
Yes. So if you're trying to reach out for a substitute decision maker, I've been in this situation as well. I mean, you check in with the rest of the healthcare team. Sometimes I'd be checking with the charge nurse, if there's a social worker on the team, depending on the situation. Do your utmost to find out who that highest ranking substitute decision maker is. There's usually contacts available in the medical chart that you can reach out. At the moment, it's not typically deemed as an emergency procedure to provide something like a swallowing assessment. There are times when under emergency you can proceed without consent, but typically there is a way to reach out to the person that can provide that consent.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah.
Okay, so I think we will have more time for questions at the end if your question hasn't been answered as well, or feel free to add some more. So let me share my screen again, and we can move on to scenario 6. So unfortunately, Mr. Bajaj has taken a turn for the worse and requires an instrumental swallowing assessment to determine attributing causes of reported residue in the pharynx and reduced airway protection. He's at risk of penetration and aspiration. Mvenwi does not have any facilities at her hospital to conduct a VFSS or FEES. Because she doesn't have these required resources, but she does feel that an instrumental swallowing assessment is warranted, what could she do? So I will launch another poll. So this is again one where you can answer more than one. What could she do now? Could she recommend a referral for an instrumental swallowing assessment? Should she do nothing because of the extended wait list for instrumental swallowing assessments? Should she continue to monitor and manage the swallowing difficulties while waiting for the instrumental swallowing assessment, or recommend that Mr. Bajaj be NPO until he is assessed? Okay, so I will close the polls and share the results. So we have quite a bit of consensus. A and C are the ones that most of the speech pathologists that are watching today agree with, although some people recommend that he be NPO until the assessment. So our thoughts are A and C, that Mvenwi should be recommending referral, and she should also continue to monitor and manage the swallowing difficulties while they wait for the instrumental assessment. If registrants are unable to provide the service they think would be best because of organizational restrictions, the ethical response would be to recommend other options to the patient. So we have standards 3 and standards 8 here. Standard 3 says speech pathologists must make appropriate and expedient referrals when they do not have the required resources or competency to conduct dysphagia intervention for a specific patient. And standard 8, speech pathologists must have the required competencies when conducting instrumental swallowing assessments. So really, you want to use your professional judgment to determine if an instrumental swallowing assessment is required. Inform the patient or substitute decision maker as appropriate if you determine this testing is needed but cannot be completed. This may be due to the patient's status, the environment, the approach, for instance, if you're seeing them virtually, or lack of resources. And ensure that you discuss and document options or alternatives as an interim plan and assess the indications and contraindications for an instrumental exam prior to implementation.
Okay, looking at standard 9, this is about informing and counseling patients on the results and findings of a dysphagia assessment and providing appropriate management recommendations. So the competencies that go with this one are about explaining, discussing, and documenting your findings and recommendations. Obviously, also looking at your patient that you're working with and what are the implications of the swallowing problems on their activities of daily living and quality of life. You will look to any further education that you can provide them to help them gain more understanding about what the swallowing problems are. You will help advocate for any necessary services and resources that will help support your patient. You'll collaborate with the patient and obviously any other relevant others on the healthcare team, family members, support persons that are there with the patient when accommodating their patient's wishes and decisions around their own healthcare. And this one you'll recognize because it came up in an earlier scenario about always delivering an inclusive, patient-centered intervention. So our scenario 7 is Mr. Bajaj is thankful for the speech pathology services and all the information provided. He asks Mivanwi to share a copy of her assessment report with his family doctor, and he also would like a copy for his own records. So the question here is, do the standards require Mivanwi to respond to his requests? There's not a poll this time. We're just going to give you the answer, and yes. Yes, she does require providing him with copies of the report. So let's have a look at that standard. This one is Documentation Standard 12. Yes, you must document all aspects of the swallowing intervention services, including any communications that you have when collaborating with others. So the competencies that go with this one include that you do effectively document all dysphagia intervention, that you accurately document communication, collaboration with all other relevant parties. And in response to this scenario, yes, it is expected that you respond to requests for documentation from others in a timely manner. And if we look at the PHIPA, the Personal Health Information Protection Act, there is a required time to respond, and it's usually within 30 days. And we do recognize that some of you in different settings, it's not you that keep the health records. It could be a health records department in hospitals. So in that case, if they've come directly to you, then you would be accountable to help them understand how to access the patient record or the report that they're requesting. And again, in a reasonable time upon request. So if we look at Mr. Bajaj, there's some new developments. Now he is keen to work on his swallowing difficulties because he wants to prepare for his granddaughter's wedding ceremonies. There will be many feasts ahead and he wants to be able to enjoy them all. So when he's discharged from the hospital, he would like to get some speech pathology services. So what will Mivanwi do? So here are her options. She could, and again, we're going to launch a poll for this, choose all that apply. She's going to set him up with a program of swallowing rehabilitation exercises and safe swallowing strategies. She could assist him with finding alternative SLP services upon discharge. She could facilitate transfer of care when he leaves the hospital with other professionals as required. So we'll give you a chance to respond to the poll. And in this case, you can check any and all that apply. And the findings are unanimously each and all of those. And again, that corresponds with the standards that we have. So yes, she can go ahead and set him up with a program, help assist with alternative SLP services, and facilitate transfer of care. There is the standard 11, which corresponds with this, that SLPs must provide appropriate recommendations for further intervention and facilitate transfer of care when required. So again, you'd be providing all the information such as what the patient's wishes are, assessment findings, the recommendations, safe swallowing strategies, the current diet texture that they are being discharged with, and swallowing rehabilitation exercises that will help.
So now we have another scenario, scenario 9. 6 months have passed. Mr. Bajaj has moved to a retirement residence in a remote part of Ontario to be near his daughter and her family. He contacts Mivanwi again because he thinks there's been another change in his swallowing and he has some new questions. He asks if an assessment could be carried out for him virtually, since she already knows his previous swallowing history. So we have our last poll of the day that I will launch. And the question is, would a virtual dysphagia assessment be permitted based on the practice standards? So you might think yes, no, or perhaps you're unsure. All right, so I will close the poll. So these are very interesting to see. It's pretty split. We had the majority of people, 2/3 said yes, 8% of people that voted said no, and then 25% said they weren't sure, weren't really sure what would be permitted here. So let's see. The answer would be yes, this could be considered. And again, this would fall under Standard 13. Speech language pathologists must ensure that virtual dysphagia intervention is in the patient's best interest and that it is feasible, appropriate, and reliable. So let's take a closer look at what the considerations would be for a virtual dysphagia assessment. Is it feasible, appropriate, and reliable? Can his daughter or someone else assist as a facilitator if there are any communication barriers or safety concerns around a virtual swallowing follow-up session, which is a really important consideration. We also want to consider which is higher risk, having no assessment or having a virtual assessment, and be sure to document your rationale. If we look, there are so many wonderful competencies under Standard 13. We want to determine risk of harm, assess the appropriateness of virtual intervention, determine what aspects of dysphagia intervention could happen virtually, employ evidence-based procedures, determine the risk associated, modify, limit, or discontinue a virtual assessment, and to develop an alternate dysphagia plan. Okay, so this brings us to our final question period. We have a few minutes left.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Dana. I guess I will start with the question that relates to what you just talked about, which is virtual dysphagia assessment, and wondering if you can share how registrants can learn more about virtual dysphagia care.
Excellent. Yes, very good question. So I think certainly all of us at the beginning of the pandemic, this was a question we all had for ourselves, for anyone who'd not really experienced providing dysphagia care virtually. Well, what did I do when I was in this situation? The first thing I did was attend as many online webinars, courses on this as possible. And I was impressed with how many countries actually were already providing virtual care. One in particular that stood out was Australia, and again, it's a vast country, probably a bit like Canada. Even within Ontario, the northern communities that are there, being able to reach them easily. So what can work with virtual care? Well, there's lots we can do that I see no issue with. Certainly when they were talking about it, was case histories can be obtained online. Observations of meals, maybe working with a support person on the other end if needed, helping train them on how you can look at some rehabilitation swallowing exercises. Again, you would probably want to establish emergency plan protocols. Follow-up is probably a very good opportunity if somebody's done an initial assessment and you can follow up. Are they following through with the exercises? Do they have any questions about the exercises? And really, I'd say be open-minded. It certainly opened my eyes when I got involved with some of this training.
I would just add that I think during the pandemic, we learned so much about virtual care. And I mean, in audiology as well, it just expanded so much. So I think a lot of things that we thought weren't possible, we realized that some things are possible to do now virtually. Mm-hmm. There's sort of a follow-up question, a couple of follow-ups related to that is it reasonable to perform a virtual assessment knowing that it will be less accurate?
I think, again, if we look at the virtual standard, which is number 13, sorry, I'm just going to look at it here. It's you're making that decision yourself. What aspects of that intervention can work virtually? Do we think all of them can? You're only going to know in each situation. I think the other thing we need to understand is across Ontario, not everyone can get to a hospital for a videofroscopy. Not everybody can easily access healthcare services. So I think, again, we have to be broad-minded about what kind of services we can also still offer rather than none at all.
Thank you. I see that we are at 2:30, so there are a couple questions left over, but we will get back to those attendees individually and respond to their questions. And thank you to everybody who submitted a question.
Yes, thank you, everybody. We'd like to thank you for joining today, for your participation, your questions, taking the time to review the standards with us on dysphagia intervention. Please reach out to us with any additional questions. I see we haven't answered all of yours. We will be following up with FAQs. I'll respond individually to those who weren't answered. And to let you know, we will provide a public-facing document for patients on what to expect when receiving dysphagia intervention by SLPs. Enjoy the rest of your day and the start of spring.